Great. Well, thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me here today. I've been asked to talk a little bit about how we might take risks, and I thought I would expand that to taking risks with not just teaching, but with sort of pedagogical approaches to taking risks, but also how we might consider taking risks when it comes to education leadership and management as well. And really, I guess the brief from the presentation, so I believe, was to stir it up a little bit. So I'm expecting to be heckled. I'm expecting for nobody to talk to me during coffee time. All right? And I'm expecting by lunchtime people to be asking some of those perhaps more deep questions in terms of exactly what did I mean and could I repeat that third joke because you didn't quite get it. All right? So we're going to talk a little bit about IT. We're going to talk a little bit about risks, but most importantly, we're going to talk a little bit about practice and perhaps focus on what some other people are doing, not just in the UK, but in other parts of the world. And then we're going to be thinking about, or you're going to be thinking about, how can we take these bits and pieces that work well in other environments, other systems, how can I take that back to my own classroom, school, local authority, system, academy chain in order to make that work for me? Because there's not, one size, fits all model. I thought I'd mention today, I don't know if you've got a mobile signal down here. We're down in the basement, aren't we? I feel like I'm in some kind of nuclear bunker down here, all right? But I don't know if you've got a mobile signal, but if you have got a mobile signal, then there's a Twitter feed here. We're just going to use the Civica Learning hashtag, and if you've got any questions like during the talk, that please fire them up, and we can maybe pick those up at the end, or we can pick them up over coffee, just to sort of try and generate a bit of a discussion around what I'm talking about. I thought I would start off with just a little bit about me, as quite often we do with these things. And all I really wanted to do was just to mention my website. I'll make sure that I give the slides to the Civica team as well. But anything that I mentioned this morning during this talk, or anything that I mentioned this morning, during the games-based learning, or this afternoon, sorry, during the games-based learning talk, I'll stick a bit of an online handout up on my website, including links to all the slides and things that are used. And please feel free to take them away, use them, pretend they're your own, share them with your colleagues. I don't really care. I'm not protective about that sort of stuff. That might be particularly important this afternoon because there's two parallel workshops, and you might think the other person is a lot more interested than me, right? But you might also have an interest in games-based learning as well. So please, dip into that and have a look. So a bit about me then is, I'm a teacher. I was a geography teacher. I've only ever worked in Scotland, although you probably guess I'm not from Scotland originally, but I've only ever worked professionally in Scotland. I spent 12 years working for East Lothian Local Education Authority, where I was a geography teacher and eventually making it to deputy head. And then I was seconded for a period of 4 years where I worked for Education Scotland. That's our national education agency. It's kind of a combination between your Ofsted and what was Bector, sort of merged together. I worked for them for 4 years, and as part of that, I worked for the Scottish Government on their technologies for learning strategy. I enjoyed that. I very much enjoyed that. I did a lot of work with games-based learning, a lot of work with schools, both in Scotland and internationally during that time. But there was an awful lot of travel, and eventually I thought it's either a case of going back to school, or becoming a full-time civil servant, which, quite frankly, appeared to be a little bit boring to me, like most of the time. I was getting away with things, because I was seconded. So about 18 months ago, I took a job back up in Highland Councils, where my rock climbing grade has improved considerably, right? And my ability to come back and relate to children again has also improved considerably. And I'm currently head teacher at Keynote High School in the Cairngorms National Park, which is a beautiful place to work. I've just advertised 4 jobs if anybody's interested. That's keynotehi.org.uk. Feel free to go in there and to explore what's going on. I'm very, very lucky, and I genuinely mean that I'm very, very lucky, but because of my involvement with government and the education agency and Civica and other companies as well, is I still get to do a lot of exciting things. Highland Council are very, very understanding. They describe it as letting me out to play, to come to events like this, and they let me come out, once or twice a month. That's the kind of agreement so that I can speak to people. They think that's kind of quite good for the school, and I think it's also probably quite good for me as well. Whether it's good for you or not, we'll find out by the end of the talk. I guess the most important thing that I really wanted to let you know about is that I really, really like cycling. So if there's anything that you disagree with, during the talk from an education and pedagogical sense, if you're interested in cycling, we could talk about that during the break, or lunchtime. I'm quite happy to do that. But actually, this is really important. This is a bit of a tenuous link, I know, right? But this is actually, an important thing, I think, in terms of setting up the talk, because I think that, when I learned to ride a bike, this was kind of like the bike that I learnt to ride, right? It was quite small, because I was quite small at the time, Right, I learned to ride it when I was a child. And it had these things here. Right, these things which we all know are called stabilizers. Very, very good for the economy, in many ways. One of the reasons they were good for the economy is it kept elastoplast in business, I think, for hundreds of years. Because, of course, what we know is that as soon as we started to remove those stabilizers, from the bike, it was actually like nothing riding a bike at all, right? And children and people would fall off, right? And they would graze themselves and they would hurt themselves. And they would basically have to teach themselves to ride the bike again. Right, and why am I telling you this? Well, I'm telling you this because basically, for years and years and years and years, we taught young people to ride bikes in completely the wrong way. But we made them do it because we thought it was the right way. And actually, if you've got young children or if you're involved in working with young children, if you're from the nursery or early years sector, quite often now we teach children to ride bikes, don't we, in completely different ways. This is a balanced bike. This is my neighbour here. It's a bike, it's got no pedals. You can actually buy these bikes with no pedals. We're a bit tight in Scotland, so we just take the pedals off of a normal bike and then put them on over time. And of course, because there's no stabilizers at all, what we're doing, well, we're actually teaching the skill of balance over time. And once that balance has actually improved, then we can think about putting the stabilizers on, and then we can actually sort of teach that child to ride a bike. And what's my point here? Well, my point is this, is that when we think about using technology in the classroom, or in fact, when we think about teaching children in the classroom, I'm quite convinced that there are things that we've been doing a long time that we think are right, because that's the way that we've always done it, but actually they're incredibly wrong. And I think this example here, or this metaphor of teaching children to ride a bike, it's not a technology solution. Well, it is actually, but we're actually removing the technology. We're removing the stabilizer, we're removing the pedals, right? And by removing the stabilizer and removing the pedals, we're actually teaching that child to ride the bike better, and then we're applying the technology in order for them to gain confidence and in order to then gain that skill. And we'll kind of think about that and keep that at the back of our mind as we sort of move through this presentation. So this is my kind of opening slide here. You'll probably remember it, and it's great to have these screens because they're nice and high definition. It's not like a normal sort of projector, isn't it? And I think if any of you are kind of involved in outdoor learning here, and if we were looking at this, I don't know whether you would agree or not. This is quite a risky activity. Imagine kind of filling in the paperwork about this. If this was going to be something that you would do on your summer camp as part of it. And the reason I'm showing you that, and the reason why I started it off with that picture, is that I have to kind of sort of, I guess, question the motivation of why these children, would take this walk, every single day, along this path. It looks pretty high, doesn't it, here? I mean, if they do take a fall, it's probably going to hurt. There's probably lots of other risks as well in terms of rocks, and other things falling down. And why, every single day did they kind of take this walk, to get to this building? And of course, the reason that they do this in this part of remote China is because every single day, or most days of the year, what they're doing is they're walking to school. And again, for me, I think it's important that we think about in the UK, that we think about, well, actually, there are lots of places in parts of the world, who are taking risks in order to improve young people's education. And whether that's the physical journey to school, or whether that's a risk in terms of an investment in a particular teacher, or a change of your management structure, or your ICT infrastructure, we've got to, I think, constantly keep our eye on that end goal, which is improving the lives of children and young people. And in order to do that, we've got to change and tweak a little bit around the edges, actually how we do things to start with. And I guess the kind of question, isn't it, then, is around this whole business of risk and reward. And if we're going to be taking these risks, how can we ensure that we've got this reward? And one of the things, or one of the kind of themes of the conference is talking about the NACE's Risk IT strategy, which some of you might have heard of before. Quite often when you hear that word strategy, you expect it to be a really, really large policy document, don't you? And that's not the case here, right? The simple underpinning arm of this idea here is that you pick a week of the year, right? And there has been for a couple of years a specific week when NACE has encouraged people to take a risk with their own practice. But actually, you could recreate this in your classroom. Right, you could recreate this in your school, and you could say, well, this is the week where I want all of my teachers to take a little bit of a risk and do something ICT that you've never done before. And the support methods that we're going to put in place is that we're going to provide you with some ICT experts, let's call them the kids in your class, right, to help support you with that. Right, and also we're going to give you an opportunity to shout about and to celebrate your success and share that with your colleagues when you do it as well. So it's this whole idea, if you like, I guess, of risk and reward. So what I wanted to start with, or talk a little bit about, I suppose, is some different examples of places that have done things differently. So there's a picture here on the screen, and if you were looking at this picture, it's a building, obviously. What sort of building does it look like? What sort of building would you think that might be? Yeah, a stadium. I mean, do you remember the Beijing Olympics? Like the bird's nest, remember that? And it was all done. I mean, when I look at that building there, it kind of reminds me of that. And just keep an eye here, on these sort of like giant coloured blocks on the top, because we'll come back to those in a second. It does look like a stadium. In fact, sport is very, very important to this building, but it's not a stadium. It's a school. Right, and some of you might have come across this school before. It's in North Tyneside. The train went past it almost yesterday as I was coming down here. It's Monksheaton High School. It's one of the only BSF schools that got produced from the original 10 architect plans that were sponsored by the UK government. I know that BSF's in the past. I know that a lot of us are involved in BSF schools here. But it was one of the ones that was built. And at the start, there were 10 schools that were designed that really were quite radical. Right, there's an awful lot of BSF schools that have been built which are really, really good, but they're still classrooms and auditoriums, and they might be quite ICT, rich environments. And this, was a little bit different in some ways. And it's interesting because they took a bit of a risk here, and as you kind of walk up to the school, you can't help but feel a little bit inspired. This is the senior management corridor, right? A term which, is not unfamiliar to a lot of us if we work in schools, particularly secondary schools. It's where the senior management live and hide, a lot of the time. All right, but I can't really hide in this one here because I use those words carefully. It is the senior management corridor. There's no offices. Right, the kids walk past, on the way to classes. The staff room's also in there as well. It's all kind of open planned. In fact, there's only 2 offices in the whole school. One for the bursar because they hold the money, and one for the PE department because they're difficult people. No, one for the PE department because they have valuables, which they collect in as part of it. The whole thing is kind of open planned. It's designed to show flow. There's a massive amount of open access computing area. It was built at the time, like a lot of BSF schools, where Wi-Fi wasn't really robust. It wasn't really being rolled out. It's a school of 750 children. They didn't have one-to-one at the time, but they could afford 650 desktop computers. And if you think about that and you think, well, actually, some people are going to be ill, and some people are going to be doing PE, and some people are going to be doing home economics, and some people are going to be doing science, then probably with 650 computers, I've already achieved my ratio of 1-to-1 of people that could use computers at that time. Right, they're thinking differently, about how they do things. The thing that you might think is a little bit strange, and you could see it from there, is the sports hall. Right, it's right in the middle of the school. It's been built in that way. Why is that? Well, because obesity was seen to be a problem, in this area of North Tyneside, and also because there were some real challenges, right, with encouraging children to participate in sports. So hang on a minute. Instead of putting the sports department at the periphery of the building, where you get sent to, why don't we actually put sport and health and well-being right in the centre of the school so that everybody can see that going on? And of course, what do we know about children's work? Well, children's work is really, really inspired through audience, isn't it? Whether that's a piece of work that they've written or typed up and turning it into a blog. But of course, sport itself is a performance activity. And isn't it a shame that we build a lot of sports halls in the UK where nobody can actually stand around and watch? Very, very different to the United States, very, very different to Canada. But of course here, it's quite good because everybody can see this. I can move these kind of computers away. Over time, these computers have become laptops. It's become even easier. People can see what's going on here. And of course, some of you are thinking, but hang on a minute, wouldn't that be quite noisy? You're right, it would be a little bit noisy, but they've been quite clever here in terms of soundproofing. It's why the building looks quite unfinished. This is all soundproofing along here, all right? And actually, if you're in this kind of open access computing area where you might get a history and a maths and an English lesson happening at the same time, it's the same kind of background noise that you might get maybe, in a supermarket, or in a shopping centre. And let's face it, the world of work is not always a quiet place anyway, is it? A lot of the time. It's very, very interesting that sometimes we make children work in silence, but of course it doesn't really resemble what happens in real life. Again, they thought differently about things. This is the maths department here. This is all soundproofing, which comes down from the ceiling. If you're a physics teacher, you'll understand this a lot better than me. The building's been built quite cheaply, right? Even though it might not look like this. The sound goes up, it bounces around here, and then it disperses, which is a lot cheaper, for example, than putting in, a suspended ceiling. It's a very, very ICT-rich environment. And if you think back to that picture that I showed you to start with, about the little Lego blocks almost, on the top of the building, those kind of red blocks, the yellow blocks, the green blocks. They're air conditioning units. And when the building was built to start with, there was a competition between the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge, because the head teacher at the time, Dr. Paul Kelly, said, I want the building kept at a constant temperature of 18.5 degrees Celsius. And I think that the initial response to that was, you're mad, right? There are lots of people that would feel quite cold in there. Right, but he'd been away and he'd done his research. In fact, that's what his PhD was in. And again, academically verified by the University of Durham, is that it's been proven now that if you're a teenager, actually going through puberty is quite a hot thing to do. Right, and if you're going up and if you're growing, right, then that takes a lot of energy in order to do that. And that's one of the reasons why you quite often see kids going around in short-sleeve shirts or T-shirts or without coats, not just because they're forgetful, because genuinely, right, their structure is actually hotter, right, than adults. So the building's kept at 18.5 degrees Celsius because that is apparently, right, the optimum temperature that children learn. You can take that away or you can leave it, it's up to you. But what I'm saying is that this is a school that's thought differently about things, and this is a school that's tried to construct its building and develop all of its structures and policies, including its ICT policy, around learning. And isn't it interesting at the moment that we're still building buildings around how environmentally friendly they are, right? And not necessarily on how good that building is in achieving its job. And its job is not to be environmentally friendly. That's part of what it needs to do. But its job, of course, is actually to try and create young people that have got the skills, and the attributes to be able to enter the world in the 21st century. Now, if you're interested in any of this kind of, neuroscience stuff in education, there's a great book, and it's a book called John Medina, who's done a bit of work from Microsoft Partners in Learning. He addressed the World Forum a couple of years ago, and he's written a book called Brain Rules. He's also written a follow-up book called Brain Rules for Babies, and it's fascinating. And one of the reasons why it's fascinating is because I can read it. Right? It's not a complicated neuroscience book. For me, it's just in a complete plain language, and it talks about, different start times at the start of the day, the importance of trying to develop memories into long-term memories, and the importance of trying to develop deep learning. And I think it's a really interesting thing to read, and something that perhaps we should be, reading in a little bit more detail. The school itself, is interesting from another point of view because of attendance. The other thing, of course, that we know about children and young people is that teenagers need a lie-in. Right, now this isn't because they've been up on Xbox playing Call of Duty Black Ops, right, with their friends in the United States all night. That might be one of the reasons. But again, it comes back to this idea that actually teenagers need sleep. Right, they need sleep. Why? Because they're growing. Right, we all know about puberty and growing and those sort of things, but actually it's hard work in order to do that. And again, the kind of research would suggest that the optimum time to start the school day if you're a secondary school pupil going through puberty, right, would be at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Now, that would be a complete nightmare, right, for the rest of society, right, so that we don't do it. We tend to sort of try and fit that in around the workday. But in Monk Seton, again, they took a slightly different view, and they thought, well, actually, we've got a real problem with attendance. We can't get kids coming in the morning. Right, starting at 11 would be a complete nightmare. But how about we make a compromise? How about we start at 10 a.m., right, which means that we can still get children in, and we can make sure that the children have got breakfast if they need it. If we start at 10 a.m., we don't need a morning break, which means that we can still finish at 4 o'clock each day, as long as we shave sort of 5 or 10 minutes off lunchtime. Right, and that's what they did, and as a result of that, attendance in the school, has gone up. The other kind of knock-on effect to that as well is that all the staff meetings are at 9 o'clock in the morning rather than at 4 o'clock at night, right, when staff are fresh, right, staff can get together, and they haven't just been teaching all day. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is right, but what I'm saying is that this is a school that's trying to do things differently, and maybe there are bits of things here that could be taken and retrofitted into your own circumstance, rather than kind of saying, well, actually, that's completely impossible. And again, this is all kind of quite well documented on the website, on the BBC. And one of the things that I really want to challenge you to do this morning and throughout the day is to ask yourself the question, why? Why do we already do it like that? Why do we have an interactive whiteboard in every room? Why do we have a computer in every room? Why do we need Wi-Fi? Why do we need one-for-one? I'm not saying that any of those things are wrong or right, because actually I think that many of them are right. But asking that question, why do we do that? Why do we have a head teacher that's appointed, rather than changing the head teacher like they do in some Scandinavian countries or parts of Scandinavia every 3 years? Why do we do that in the UK? And one of the reasons behind that, of course, is because we've always done it that way. I work for Highland Council now. For the first time in my life, I get 2 weeks off in October. And the reason I get 2 weeks off in October is because that's when all the kids go potato picking. Apart from they don't anymore. All right? They did, probably back in the 1930s and 40s, and it was great that we established that 2-week holiday then, but do we really need it now? Well, yes, and the reason that we really need it is because we've always had it. But actually, it doesn't make a lot of sense, in many ways. And there's different questions, I guess, that we need to be asking, around some of these things. So, fascinating school, and we'll look at some other interesting schools as well. And the last thing I guess I wanted to sort of pick up on as well, again linked into neuroscience, is this idea of what's called spaced learning. And again, if you're a secondary school teacher, I think there's a lot of merit in this kind of research. And it's this idea of when you're revising for an exam, to try and turn short-term memories into deep memories to improve recall by running short, sharp, quite focused lessons with different types of input, some with ICT and some without ICT, and in between that, doing other activities which exercise different parts of the brain. All right, so spaced learning, I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but again, there's some really interesting sort of information on this, and again, it's done in the school. The Wellcome Trust, which some of you will be familiar with, have just picked up on this and have just commissioned a large-scale research project to this for 30 schools within the UK. So I think we'll see more about this sort of stuff in the news over the coming sort of weeks and months. So what am I saying here then? Well, I guess what I'm saying is that this is a school that's tried to do something, and it's done something differently, and they've taken risks. But I would argue that some of these risks are controlled risks in many ways. One of the reasons that they're controlled is that they changed the school day, and they did that not because they thought it was a good idea, but because they could back that up with research. Right? One of the reasons why they were able to trial the 8-minute lessons is because they did that with a research partner. Again, it was the University of Durham, right, and they were able to collect that research as they went along. And one of the things that I'm constantly sort of trying to talk about when I talk to head teachers and deputy head teachers and leadership teams is that we're in a really, really interesting stage now, I think, throughout the UK, where if we're trying to justify spend on ICT, we have finally got to a stage where we do have the research to start to back that up. Right? We do have the research to sort of try and back that up. 10 years ago, let's be honest, nobody really knew whether it worked or not. A lot of the research, was quite superficial in many ways. Right? But increasingly, because of organisations like JISC and NACE and other sponsored research, we're starting to build up a big research pool of actually how good integration of ICT can have a benefit on teaching and learning. So one of my bits of advice to you is if you're going to your school governors or your academies trust or whoever you go to, is to try and pitch your argument, not just around what other schools are doing, although that helps, getting them into another school where it's working would also help, but also as well trying to link that into research, or indeed making sure that any ICT spend is done in parallel with your own action research so that you can contribute that towards the overall pool. So how do we take controlled risks in schools? Well, one of the things that I think that we can do that is that we can have a little think about what could we learn from enterprise, right? What can we learn from enterprise? Because it seems to me, if we look at different enterprises that maybe have not been particularly successful, in recent years, let's take the banks, right, and let's take Woolworths, for example, then these are both examples of enterprises that have been run and delivered and managed in quite an old-schooled hierarchical way in lots of ways. They're very, very top-down, they're very, very top-heavy, right? And let's face it, they failed. Who would have thought a number of years ago that Woolworths would fail? But it did, right? Even the people that were running the school, right, thought that they were, running the shop and the chain, thought they were doing a good job until they went bankrupt. Right? Let's think about banks. Banks are in a very, very similar position. The only reason that lots of banks have actually survived is because we own them. Right? We don't often see our returns from that, right? But many of the banks now obviously are owned by the taxpayer. So what's my point? Well, my point is that the organisations that have survived and the organisations that are thriving are ones that are run and managed and delivered in a completely different way, a more efficient way, and they're not tied down by bureaucracy. And if we're in a situation where organisations have evolved, then we must surely be in a situation now in 2014 where schools, need to evolve as well. And again, it's thinking about things differently. So here's something else to think about. 120 children. So just think about that 120 children to start with. And just think a little bit about what does that mean to you? What would that look like? Right? Think about the last time you came in contact, with 120 children. What would that look like? Imagine them in the room. How much room would they take up? Doesn't matter whether they're little nursery children or secondary children. How much space would they take up? What would that look like? And the reason I'm kind of saying this is because, if you work in a primary school, if you works in a primary school in Scotland, one of my associated primary schools, has got 24 children in it. Right, it's a very, very small primary school. If you work in a primary school, that might be your whole school role. It might be half of your school role. Right? If you work in a secondary school, that might be year 7. I don't know. Right? It might be half of year 8. It depends on the size of the school. But probably the thing that you're not thinking about is that you're not thinking about, well, that might be a class size. Right, 120 children is the amount of children that I've got in a class. Right, now, we know that large class sizes are not uncommon in certain parts of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where there are massive class sizes to one teacher or somebody that's prepared to stand in front of the children. But it might surprise you to know that 120 children is the minimum class size that you would get in any of the Catholic schools in the province of New South Wales in Australia. And one of the reasons for that is because they've built what we call these super classes. Now, I'm not saying there's 120 children and one teacher, right, because that probably would be regressive. That would be going backwards, in lots of ways. But what we're saying here is that there's never less than 120 children in this very, very big, very, very flexible learning space. And what's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is, first of all, we know, although we don't always build schools to accommodate this, is that we know that sometimes an adult could speak to a group of young people, and there might be 50 or 60 or 70 young people, and they could engage them for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and that would be fine, depending on the content and depending on the activity. We also know, of course, that sometimes it's good for children to be working with children, or adults to be working with children in smaller ratios. Sometimes we know for children that are incredibly severe and complex, we maybe need 2, 3, or 4 adults to one child, right, depending on their particular needs. And of course, this model here allows us to do that. The other thing that, of course, it allows us to do is that we know, again through research, that one of the biggest ways that we can improve learning is through feedback to children, feedback to teachers, and appropriate CPD. Now, in this kind of classroom setup here, you can't not get feedback to teachers because all of the teachers have to work together, they have to plan together, they have to deliver the learning activities for the day, the week, the month, and the year together. And again, if you go to these schools and visit these schools, people will say that the best professional development they get is doing their job. Now, isn't that an interesting kind of situation to be in as well? As you'll see from the picture, incredibly technology-rich environment, allowing for some personalized learning through the use of technology, right? But also other types of learning as well through the use of a whole range of different types of activities. I'm not saying that this is right or wrong, but what I'm saying is that this is a different example of a different school system, right, in a high-achieving part of the world, right, who are doing things differently. And again, our job here, or my job this morning here, is to challenge some of our traditional thoughts and think about how might I take the best bits, and how might I create that. Campbelltown Grammar School in Scotland, right, it's just built a super class on the top floor of its building, right, and it's doing that for secondary school children, right. Teachers work in groups of 3, right, to deliver activities to groups of 50 or 60 children. One teacher to set the task and to work with the kids, one person to stretch the kids, who are really able to achieve a task straight away, and one person with some support assistance to help and to nurture the kids that are really struggling. Different things, done in different ways, and again, always supported through the use of good ICT. So what am I saying? Well, it's thinking a little bit about the problem, isn't it, I guess, and then thinking about different ways that we might be able to solve it. So here's a problem that we've got in Scotland at the moment, and I'm sure that it's pretty much similar across the UK as well. We've got a problem with getting people to read. Sound familiar? In lots of ways. In particular, boys. Right? Not girls as well, to be honest. Right? In particular, boys. Right? We've got a problem with getting boys to read in schools. And the more and more I think about this, the more and more I kind of come to the conclusion that the reason that we've got a problem getting boys to read in schools and girls is because it's not that they don't want to read. it's because we make them sit on these things. And the reason that I'm saying that is because when I go on holiday, or when I'm traveling, like I was on the train yesterday, and there was groups of kids on the train, you see kids, reading in all kinds of different environments. They're sat on the floor, they're sat by a tree, they're laid on their front, right? They're reading different things, all of the time. And actually, I think that it's not that we've got necessarily a problem with reading, we've got a problem of, how do we encourage people to read? I love the example of bringing the dog into school, right? I think that's a fascinating thing. Some people will say, oh, that's a bit of a gimmick. But you know what? If that gimmick lasts 6 months, I don't care about that. If that encourages a group of children to read more and to improve their learning over 6 months, then why not give it a go? Why not try, some of these things? It's got to be worth doing. So what's my point here? Well, my point, I guess, is summed up quite nicely by this picture here. A picture from the London Underground. I'll just run through this for you if you can't see it. This is a laptop. This is a mobile phone. It's an Amazon Kindle Mark 1. This is looks like an iPod Touch or an iPhone. This is a book, if anybody's confused there. And the interesting thing, right, that we see about this picture here, and why I think it's a wonderful picture, is because every single one of these people in the real world are engaged with text. They might be reading text, they might be listening to text, they might be creating their own text by speaking into it or typing it out, but they're all engaged with text in different ways. And I guess that what I'm trying to say here a little bit is that, if we really, really want to encourage children to read, or if we really want to encourage numeracy, if we really want to encourage health and well-being, we need to be thinking about how do we deliver these personalized learning opportunities for young people and adults in different ways. There's got to be that element of choice, not just in terms of what they read, but how they read it and when they read it. Now, these are difficult questions to answer, for a school, but I do think that they're quite important. And that's, as I think about this, and I come back to some of these things, I quite often think about when we're building schools these days or creating schools, that maybe, we should be thinking about what are our national priorities and how can we provide some kind of local solutions to that. I'll give you an example, right, just so I can explain this a little bit better. Where I used to live and used to work in East Lothian, if you know Scotland, just to the east of Edinburgh, and I used to live right by the sea. Right? I grew up in Weymouth, right by the sea, where the Olympic sailing was last year. And where I used to live in East Lothian, my local Tesco store where I did my shopping, if I went in, all right, I could buy buckets and spades. I could buy my groceries as well, but as I went in through the door, there was the newspapers, there was buckets and spades, and there was little things. All right? Where I live now, near Aviemore, near Cairngorm Mountain, Scotland ski resort, well, it's got a bit of snow on it. Very rarely can you ski there. All right? When I go into my local Tesco store, the layout is almost exactly the same as the place where I lived in East Lothian, yet as I go in through the door, I can't buy a bucket and spade. Why would I want to? I'm not going to go to the beach, but I can buy a sledge, a children's sledge at different times of the year. Right, now, why am I saying this? Why is this important? I'm saying this because, again, business and enterprise, they've actually created really, really efficient models where they can put something in that works that's almost 80% the same in every place that they build it, yet that final 20% around the door, near the checkout, its location, how people park, depending on people if they're disabled, whether they're going to cycle in, whether it's pedestrianised or not, that extra 20% is different, which means you still kind of get that almost personalised shopping experience under a very, very efficient model, right? And what my point is here really is that I just kind of wonder, if we're developing classrooms, if we're developing schools, why don't we try to get this kind of model where we're building things almost 80% the same, right? But again, we're coming back and we're looking at that 20%, which is a little bit different, because we generate our efficiencies from the 80, but that 20% provides that personalisation and choice that we need. And that's really what I mean that, right? We've got Tesco, it's got national priority, provide people, make money, and to provide people with their shopping, right? But it provides a local solution depending on where it's located. And from an education point of view, from working with children and young people, of course, that local solution needs to be that personal solution. How do we develop personalised learning with children and young people? Let's look at a couple of other schools. I noticed there was a whole variety of people in the audience this morning, so I've picked a few different examples here. I'm going to pick some international schools, right, because I think that's important, and we won't hopefully get too frustrated about that. This is a school, example of a school. It's called Tinkering School. I don't know if anybody's ever come across this before. I've purposely picked it. It's like a middle school, so that would be kind of the equivalent, I guess, of like year 6 to it wouldn't be like I get my years like year 5 to maybe year 8. That would be that kind of block there. It's a school in the United States of America. There's a few of these now. Straight away, there would be alarm bells ringing about the health and safety requirements, of this particular school. Try and ignore that, right, and try and get through it. It's a fascinating school, right, in lots of ways, because everything is done through building stuff. Right, everything is done through building stuff and project work, for significant chunks of time. There are still times when, the young people are obviously in classrooms and they're doing things, but stuff is actually done through the contextual idea of building stuff. And let's face it, right, if we take learning back to what it actually is in its most fundamental sense, learning is making stuff, isn't it, and telling stories. That's how we've learned for years and years and years. And that's what this kind of school is about. Worth checking out. There's a great TED talk on it. And it just, again, will sort of stretch your thinking about what is being done in different parts of the world. I'm going to show you a little tiny clip of the school because they also work towards these projects. And one of the projects that they worked towards was that it was a maths and physics project, and obviously engineering and science as well. One of the projects that they worked towards was getting the kids to build their own roller coaster. Right, now, hear me out here. Right, this might not work in your school, right, and I appreciate that. Right, but what I'm saying is that it has worked here. Right, and there's been some gain of it. And it's a beautiful kind of little clip. At the end of their project work, it's 6 weeks.
2, 1, go!
Right, this is the roller coaster that they've built. Right, there's all the kind of the maths and the physics and the teamwork and everything else which has been involved in it.
A roller coaster built by 7-year-olds.
It didn't quite finish the end, but it was all right. It didn't work too well anyway. All right, and again, what's my point? Well, my point is that this is an example of a place that's doing things differently. It might not be appropriate to our own local circumstance. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't dismiss it. One of the reasons that I mention it is because a lot of the kind of theory behind Tinkering School is based around the notion of play. And we've already mentioned that there'll be a session on games-based learning later on this afternoon. But I think that whole idea of play is really, really important. And if there are nursery colleagues in the room, which I think that there are, they will tell us as secondary practitioners that they base most of their curriculum around play, right? And that by the time children get to secondary school, we don't let them play enough, and quite frankly, we beat the creativity out of them. All right? And I think it's important, right? I think it's important that we embrace the notion of play, in every kind of age and stage of children's life. And I wonder whether we could just maybe reflect on this a second here. So this was my favourite board game as a kid. Do you remember that? Mousetrap? Yeah? And I've often kind of tried to reflect a little bit on, well, why was that my favourite game? And the kind of conclusions that I reached to when I think about that was because it was an interesting game, but when I was playing the game, it offered me a degree of challenge. We progressed through the game. It was competitive as well, because you couldn't really play it by yourself. There had to be at least one other player there to do it. That's where the challenge came from. And at the end of it, there was a reward. Right? You caught the mouse. And in fact, everybody, even if you didn't win the game, thought there was a reward because you caught the mouse. And that's what you were all trying to do. That's what you were trying to achieve, as a team. And it was a great game, right, to play until you lost one of the bits. All right? But that aside, most good games, successful games that have stood the test of time have these 3 principles: challenge, progression, reward. And why these 3 terms I think are particularly important, of course, is because is that not what we're trying to do in our schools and classrooms? Are we not trying to challenge kids? Are we not trying to provide them with good progression? And are we not trying to reward them for what's going well? Right, and these are the 3 basic principles, if you like, of play. And of course, then, if we take that to the domain of computer games, games consoles, online computer games, and we add sort of quite sophisticated, rich databases or artificial intelligence, then of course what we start to end up with is these kind of quite personalized learning experiences, but also things happening in real time. So if I take then what's good about a game and expand that to what's good about a computer game, and I think about challenge, progression, rewards, personalized, real-time feedback, then again, there's a massive amount, I think, that we could learn from the domain of computer games to actually be applying that in traditional classroom settings. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? Some people will be thinking, that's all very well, right? But the domain of computer games is the domain of teenagers that are sponsored by Clearasil, all right? These are the domain of teenagers that sit there and they're not animated and they don't have any social skills at all. I'm not advocating highly violent games, by the way. I think games need to be age appropriate. They need to be appropriate, full stop, like any learning resource. But I thought I'd just show you these pictures. These were taken by a French artist, and I think they're brilliant. This is a French artist who put a camera on top of an Xbox 360, and he just took pictures of people as they were playing games. And I'd like to show these to people because, quite often the people that say, well, if people are playing computer games, there's no emotion at all, the people that say that are people that haven't played computer games. And it's interesting to look at these pictures, right, because when you start to look at the kind of concentration, on different people's faces, the emotion, if you like, which is running through, and the sheer delight almost when you get to the end, computer games can be incredibly rich and rewarding and collaborative spaces for people either to relax and to release, but also as well, to make quite powerful learning environments. And again, if we look at a different school, this is a school in New York. There's another one now in San Francisco. Again, it's a charter school, the same age group that I described before, Quest to Learn. Again, it's highly ICT rich. And Quest to Learn takes it a stage further from Tinkering School, which is about building stuff with our hands and using some computers. And this then becomes, a little bit more about building stuff digitally and doing stuff with our hand. It's almost the complete reverse. And again, this is, quite well written up. If you follow the WISE Foundation, that's going to be in the book later in the year.
Some of us are gamers, and some of us are bloggers.
We learn to be scientists, game designers, and mathematicians.
I make clue videos.
College is a big focus at our school.
At Quest to Learn, we learn to design and invent things. Our teachers work with game designers to create game worlds in which we learn to be scientists, writers, archaeologists, graphic artists, and architects, and other real-world professions. This is a school for kids of today who use computers, games, iPods, blogs, and other digital tools. We open this September with a 6th grade. At Q2L, we imagine the future.
So again, it's an interesting place. That school now has been running. It's into its second year. As I say, the second school opened in September last year, and they're delivering some really, really interesting results. And again, my point here is, well, what's the point of showing us that? That's nothing that we do now. The point is, well, actually, if you're interested in change and want to embrace change, then getting onto their website, seeing some examples of what children can achieve at the same age and stage as your children, and then copying their ideas, even if it's just one idea, what kind of impact might that have? It's about hoovering up the best bits, not simply replicating things that didn't work. And again, I think there's lots of things that we can kind of learn and we can kind of take from that idea of games. And the gamification of learning is something which is talked about a little bit now, and it's thinking about what can we take from computer games and how can we apply, for example, computer game credit into the real life classroom. And this is an interesting thing. The University of Indiana were one of the first people to do this. But this whole idea of that, in schools quite often, we get children working on a piece of work, and then at the end of that piece of work, we give them grades. And there might be one child that does all of the work the night before, and they get an A, because they're brilliant, and they're naturally talented, right? And they really frustrate you, because they do nothing in your classroom, right, but they've got supportive parents and they can pull it out of the bag at the last minute. They have to get an A because that's the assessment criteria. And then you've got another child who works really, really hard. They're in school at break time, lunchtime, after school, and they hand in their final piece of work, even though they've done hours of work and they've been working their socks off, and they only get a B or a C, right, because their final product isn't good enough. And of course, actually, in the domain of a computer game, that would never happen. Right, you would get what's called experience points, right, and these experience points are given for the amount of time that you spend playing the game, the amount of time that you spend learning, right, and the amount of time, the amount of effort that you put in as well. So yes, you still might get to your end goal to get your rewards, right? But at the same time, you're also being rewarded for your effort that you put in as well. And this notion of digital badges, right, and recording or giving kids, if you like, digital credit for effort, for being classroom monitors, for being digital ambassadors, is starting to grow real traction. This idea that actually, you know, you could give a kid something virtually to reward them for what they've done. It might sound a bit ridiculous, but we've been giving stickers and badges for years, like in the Scouts and the Guides and in schools. But actually, this kind of virtual currency, you know, for some young people, you know, is incredibly important. And it's also incredibly cheap, you know, to administer, you know, as a school as well. So this whole idea of digital badges, I think, is a really interesting one. And that kind of like takes me into a different type of school. We could argue maybe that it's not a school. And I'll talk a little bit about, you know, Khan Academy. I'm sure that everybody in here will have heard a little bit about Khan Academy. It's not the only example that I want to mention here. But the example of Khan Academy is, of course, it's a number of, well, actually hundreds now, of small YouTube videos that have been put online, you know, which are designed for people to watch and be self-taught. And it's interesting, I think, from 2 points of view. One of the reasons why it's interesting is because people are accessing the videos. The other reason why it's interesting is that if you actually are a bit sad like me and you get into the real breakdown of where the videos are being accessed from, it's interesting that many of the videos are being accessed from Southeast Asia and China, and not as many from the UK and the USA. So what you've got there is you've got a motivated group of people, whether they're young or not, that are wanting to improve their mathematics and physics and other skills. And why I'm interested in that is because that's where our economic competitiveness is going to come from in the future, right? But the other reason, I guess, why it's interesting as well is because it's starting to change the model, you know, of how we might deliver lessons in class. I don't want to talk or go on about sort of reverse learning or, you know, or flip learning, but this idea now that with high technology environments, both in school at home, that a young person could be getting some specialized input via an online tutorial, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and then the teacher being used to discuss that input when they come back to class. You know, it was a different way, you know, of delivering perhaps a traditional classroom lesson where the teacher was the expert and the activity might be the online part. Right? We're starting to change around and we're starting to, you know, flip our model of learning, you know, a little bit more. And of course, it's not just, you know, it's not just sort of Khan Academy that are doing this. Khan Academy is interesting as well because people say, well, how do we know that kids are actually, you know, watching the videos? Well, we can track them now. Again, it's got quite a sophisticated area of digital badges and sponsored by the Gates Foundation. But there's also as well lots and lots of other examples online where both pupils, right, and staff can go to get online professional development. And again, I just kind of think in UK schools, we're not really making as much use of these as we should be. One of the reasons that we don't make use of them with our students is because quite often governments don't recognise them because there's no formal certificate. But one of the reasons as well is because we don't actually promote them to our students as possible sources of information. And we don't also promote them to our staff as possible sources of professional development. Now, I talk a lot about kind of pedagogy and improving learning and teaching, but subject knowledge is also incredibly important. When I did my geography degree and trained to be a geography teacher, I don't think we mentioned global warming once. Yet now, if I'm teaching a certificate class, that would be a big part of the course. How do I update my skills and knowledge about that? Well, one of the ways that I could do that is by taking part in a free online course. Right? I could subscribe, for example, to a unit from the Open University. I could listen to and watch exactly the same lectures as somebody that was doing an undergraduate geography degree in climate science. I just wouldn't get the certificate because I've not paid for that part of it. Right? But actually, I would get the learning part of it as well. So subject knowledge and using these things is important as well. So we've talked about then, mentioned Monk Seaton, we've looked at sort of Tinkering School, we moved on to Quest to Learn, we look at Khan Academy, iTunes U. There's lots of different environments here where we've kind of got these online schools. And the question that quite often get then is around the fact, well, if we're talking about all this content being online, what happens to the teacher? And I quite like this quote here from a good friend and an absolute genius, Sagar Dimitri, who's at the University of Newcastle. And he coins this phrase when he's speaking to people, and that's around a teacher that can be replaced by a machine should be. And that's very different to the phrase, teachers should be replaced by machines. Right? There's a subtlety in there which sometimes people don't get, but a teacher that can be replaced by a machine should be. Right? And I think that bit's true. And actually, that underpins, or that statement underpins, a lot of the theory behind kind of flipped learning and other things, is that the teacher, it might have some subject expertise, but they might not be the expert in that field. So why not then, give the world leader, the world expert in that field, why not expose your children to them via a short video clip, right? And then actually making sure that the children have understood that. That's the domain of the teacher. That's the domain of the facilitator. So it's interesting, interesting concept. And the other kind of thing I wanted to mention here as well was this. Do you remember this character, Supergran? All right. And the reason that it was Jeff Capes was in it, wasn't he? Ridiculous kind of late 70s, 80s TV show. But the reason I mention it is because it takes us on to a different type of school. All right. And this is a school with Granny Cloud, which some of you might have heard of, again, comes from Civica Mitra. So the idea behind this was, well, how do we improve the English teaching ability of young children living in some of the slums in India? Well, what we'll do, because there's good connectivity, is we will put an advert in the Guardian newspaper, and we will ask for any volunteers from the UK who are retired, able to give up an hour a week, and can use Skype. And then what we'll do is we'll take these people, we'll interview them to make sure that they are retired and can use Skype, and we will encourage them to Skype into an Indian classroom for an hour a week or an hour every 2 weeks to read the children's stories. Simple idea, right? Very, very simple idea, which worked and is starting to be, expanded a little bit more. Fascinating project if you've not seen it.
Val Almond and Debbie Mann are the vanguard of a revolutionary new approach to global education. Once a week, they log onto their computers to talk to, read, and play games with groups of children from remote parts of India.
Hello. My name is Debbie, and I live in Loughborough, which is in the middle of England. Can you see this picture?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah.
This cross-cultural education project is the brainchild of Professor Civica Mitra, who, originally from India himself, took on a post at the University of Newcastle 4 years ago.
And I kind of stopped that there, and there's a couple of interesting points from that story, really. Is one of the interesting points, I think, is that web-based video conferencing is one thing that we don't make enough of in schools. And if we look through the agenda, there's a session on kind of iPads later, and there's obviously Apple's FaceTime. There's a session on Microsoft 365, Microsoft Link. Skype is becoming increasingly popular, in schools. There's lots of, if you like, technologies that can be used now in order to link schools to schools, classrooms to classrooms in different parts of the world. So this isn't just about, people from the UK video conferencing into Indian classrooms and trying to improve the education system there. This is also about enriching the lives of our children, by being able to video conference with experts or different people in parts of the world. I was in a wonderful lesson last week. It was in my geography department in the school. And we take part in Skype in the classroom. We do a lot of work with Skype in the classroom. And it was a wonderful lesson because they do a thing that's called mystery Skype. I don't know if you've come across it before. And what mystery Skype is as a teacher, you register, Skype in the classroom, skype.com/education. You register. You find other teachers around the world that also want to take part. You sort out your problems with time zones, all right? And then your class is there, their class is there, and then you take it in turns, one child from your class, one child from the other class, to ask the other class questions, while everybody else is running around the room on the computers, on Google Earth, opening atlases, trying to work out where they are. And eventually, over the course of a 45-minute period, you kind of narrow this down and you see how accurate that you can get it. And the school from New York, it was a school from New York, we were 2 schools away. They just beat us, right, because they managed to narrow it down to the other school, which is also in our valley as well. But a fascinating learning experience, not just on teamwork, but also on kind of global collaboration. And actually, what a great way to introduce time zones as well with things. Now, the reason I mentioned Civica Mitra is because, again, it links into something else. There's a toolkit which has been produced. It's called the SOLE toolkit, S-O-L-E, Self-Organized Learning Environments. Right? And this is around the whole idea of asking the children a question and then making sure that they've got the technology to go and figure out the answer. So again, it's about asking a difficult question, sometimes a question which might be ungoogleable. That's always quite a good question to ask. There aren't many, right? A question that might be ungoogleable, but then children go away and they research different aspects of it and then have to come back and present the information to you. Self-organized learning environments. And they're called SOL classrooms. There's two SOL classrooms in the UK now. There's a number around the world. It's this whole idea of trying to build these schools in the cloud. But again, it's an idea that can be taken and it can be put into our own thing. So we looked at Tinker in School. We looked at Quest to Learn. I mentioned Khan Academy. We've looked at the Granny Cloud there. Briefly mentioned the SOL Toolkit. Why do these things work? Well, they work, I think, right, because all of these things, even Monk Seton High School, has been built with one thing in mind, right, and that's the learner or it's the child. They're incredibly child-centered. And another thing that we should be doing in our schools, right, it needs to be child-centered. It's not being built for the staff, although keeping the staff happy does help, right, but quite often that you will find if you keep the children happy, the staff will be happier anyway. If you keep the staff happy, right, the children will still be unhappy, which means the staff remain unhappy, right? So my advice is always, let's focus on the children, right? If the children are there, if the children are learning, then hopefully things will be all right. And, when we talk about these things, again, I'm not sort of saying that we have to do this or we have to do that. I think the best thing that maybe would come out of this talk is that people go away and you maybe kind of, investigate Tinker in School or Quest to Learn or SOL. And if you could take one idea from that, right, and apply that to your own local need, right, then I think that this session would be worthwhile, right? If you can't do that and you can't go away and do that and you keep doing exactly the same as what you've been doing now, right, then that's fine as well. It's just that things might not progress as fast as you necessarily want them to do. Now, the other thing I guess I should sort of mention at this point is that quite often people say, well, yeah, it's all very well, doing these kind of SOL activities or going back and learning through play, but we've done that before. We tried that 5 years ago, right, and we tried to be a little bit more free with our curriculum, and it just didn't work. And I think it's really, really important to remember that schools move on a lot in 1 year, right? They move on a huge amount in 5 years, a massive amount in 10 years, an awful lot in 20 years. And actually, when I'm working with staff, particularly my staff, I sort of say, look, it's okay to reinvent the wheel. Our challenge is that we need to reinvent it, right, in a different way. Right? And it's the difference which is important. So this isn't, we have done that before, right? This is thinking, if we're going to do it again, how are we going to do it in a different way? And again, I think we can maybe look to industry here as an example, all right? And my example here from industry might be around Amazon, all right, and Borders Bookshop. So Amazon came around. What does it do? It sold books online. Right, imagine going into the bank and trying to get some backing for that for your business model. I want to set up an online bookshop. Ridiculous. Right, everybody wants to go to Borders and drink coffee and flick through the books. And of course they did. All right, but they persevered, and now they sell lots of other products. Right? They didn't invent the bookshop. They just invented how books and products and other things have been sold online. And of course, now they're reinventing how we read books on the Kindle, and also Amazon self-publish, how we actually publish books as well. Right? They've reinvented lots of different things there, but they didn't invent the bookshop. They just said, right, we're going to sell books, but we're going to do it in a different way. So the challenge is we're going to teach children how are we going to do that in a different way? How are we going to improve that, right, to make sure it's more efficient and more beneficial? Horrible picture coming up now. And it's interesting, isn't it, right? Because this is what you look like at the moment, right, when we see that. And it's interesting, right? And the reason I show this is I know very little about the English education system because I've worked in Scotland professionally. I've only ever worked in Scotland. But I just kind of wonder, when I chat to my friends and things that live and work in England at the moment, I think this question here, I understand the current government's vision for education, right? And you might do and you might not, or you might think it's a little bit mixed, right? Depending on what your own kind of views and opinions are. But at the same time, when I speak to people, I sort of say, well, look, we are where we are. So regardless of kind of politics, we have to, within our own schools and classrooms, keep moving forward. And in fact, since the coalition government, we've seen some of our most innovative practice in classrooms because some teachers have just carried on doing it, right? Other people have said, well, this is actually going to stifle innovation, so we're going to step back now and we're going to carry on not doing what we already weren't doing in the first place, right? So we still need to be encouraging, right, and nurturing and moving on innovation. But kind of in a bit of a defense to the government, I think it would kind of be fair to say that actually education is quite a hard thing to do, all right? And when we, talk about education, we maybe need to think about, well, it's a pretty complex problem, so how can we think of some innovative solutions here? And this is kind of sort of final part of my talk, really. And I'll use this as an opportunity to sell some of my inventions. And I'll also use this as an opportunity just to kind of explain why a lot of big ICT projects fail. So, has anybody ever been out for a Chinese meal and you're eating some noodles and they burn your mouth, they're really hot? Anybody ever experienced that before? Pasta or anything? Yeah? Well, I've got this invention, right, that I've made. It's a pretty clever idea. So you get some chopsticks and you attach this kind of fan to it here. And in the time it takes you to get the noodles or the pasta from the bowl to your mouth, the fan has cooled the noodles down. All right? So that removes the problem of it. The problem with my invention, like many of them, just like many ICT initiatives, is sustainability. All right? What do I do when the batteries run out? How do I replace that? What do I do now that BSF has ended? I've got all these computers in school and I need to replace things. Any investment that I need to make has got to be sustainable, right? And in lots of places at the moment, it isn't necessarily sustainable. Got another invention. I've got a real problem with cleaning. Luckily, my next door neighbour, they've got a young child just starting to crawl, which is fantastic. I've got this thing which I can attach to them. I don't use staples or anything like that. You know, it's just kind of, they just kind of lay on it. I offer to babysit, which helps them, right? And as they come round, my floors get cleaned perfectly, all right? But the problem with my invention here, just like many of my other inventions and actually a lot of ICT solutions in schools, is it isn't particularly adaptable. I'm hoping that my next door neighbours are reproducing, right, as we speak at the moment, all right? Because eventually this child is going to grow up, right? They're not going to want to do this for me anymore, all right? And as a result of that, I'm probably going to have to pay them. It's going to cost me a lot of money, right? It's an unadaptable solution. And solutions that are unadaptable, even though they might be good to start with, always end up costing you money. Right? And that's something we need to keep, I think, at the back of the mind. And this was a little bit like me last night, but I didn't bring it with me. Right? And this is this idea around the fact that, you know, sometimes when I'm a bit tired, and I used to do a lot of travel, I was on the train or I was on the bus, all right? And I would kind of like fall asleep. And as I was drifting off, I'd kind of like jar my head back. There's probably a couple of people doing that this morning, jarring your head back, and I'd get this whiplash. So I invented this. Right, just sucker it on the door. It's not just these red hats you get a variety of hats. It's quite personalized in many ways. But the challenge with it is, again, like many ICT solutions or problems in schools, is that I'm fixing the problem, but I'm not solving it. Right, so the problem with when I fall asleep on the train and the bus is not a problem with my neck. It's a problem because I'm tired, because I'm working too hard, I'm traveling too far, right, and I shouldn't be doing that in the first place. So I'm putting a quick fix in there. I'm sticking a Band-Aid on it, right, to fix a broken arm. Right? And what we need to think about in some of our big solutions here is we need to think about, well, actually, how do we fix these in a better way? How do we solve the problem? And the challenge for schools and head teachers is sometimes people don't actually know what it is they're trying to solve. I want to get a class full of iPads. Why? Because it'd be good to have a class full of iPads, and the school next door have got them. But what's the problem that we're going to solve? I want to get a class full of laptops. What's the problem we're trying to solve? All right? What's the problem? Do I want to improve literacy, numeracy, health and well-being? Right? Because if that's the problem, let's look at the ICT solution for that, because the ICT solution can contribute to all of those things. And we'll finish off with just one kind of like closing remark. Different example again. Let's take something else. Education is complicated. Right? Let's take two things that are complicated here and look at how they are solved. So first one here, water. Right? Fresh water, that's a complicated problem, isn't it, if we don't have any? How can we solve that? How can we deliver fresh water to sub-Saharan Africa? Well, we could look at an example here. This is a pretty innovative solution, I think. People think in a different way. Fascinating example. It's called play pumps. It's this idea that children, they like to go out and play. Doesn't matter where they are in the world. And we could put in an expensive electric pump, but it's not sustainable. It's not adaptable over time. It's not solving the problem. It's just fixing it temporarily. But this is an interesting thing here because we've got this children's merry-go-round. It only goes one way. And as the children are playing on the merry-go-round, right, it uses this pump, a mechanical pump. There's no electric part in it, right, to go up and down to pump the water for this village, which is up in the tank up here. Two sides which are used for advertising, right, to actually kind of get funding for the project. two sides which provide health information. You know, I could get adults to do it, right? But in this type of village, in this part of the world, the adults are away doing other things, right? Working, right? Getting food, maybe getting water from elsewhere. Children are outside playing, but as they're playing outside, right, they're also able to kind of gather this water. You know, it's an innovative solution to a complex problem. It's child-centered. It involves play, and the technology is not as complicated as you might think. Sometimes the simplest technology is the best type of technology to solve innovative problems in schools and other parts of the world. And we'll just finish on this. Obesity. That's a complicated problem, right? How do we get people to be more active? So, all right, it's playful, it's people-centered, it's different, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, anything that we're trying to do in our schools is about the experience, right? People can have good experiences and bad experiences with technology, but ultimately, right, it's the type of experience that we deliver as teachers and school leaders that will actually have that impact in our schools, will boost attainment, and ultimately, hopefully, improve the lives of children and young people. Thanks very much.